Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
Yep, and this time we have just been through Jacob's exodus out of Laban's country, and now we are coming back to the land of Israel, and we're going to meet Esau on the way as we follow Jacob. And so we're in chapter 32 before we get going here. And so, if you're reading along, pause, go read, listen, whatever, come back, however you do that. And we're going to be talking about as he comes into the land of Canaan, and he comes to a place that he calls Mahanaim, which means two camps. And that's because he comes in and he sees angels that are meeting him, and he says this is God's camp. And so that Mahanaim is denoting his camp and God's camp there together. So
what's the significance of him encountering angels again?
Yeah, and actually, I think Sailhammer points this out, and I might actually footnote this in the book, I can't remember. But Sailhammer points out and thinks that this is him symbolizing the cherubim that are stationed on the edge of the garden. And so as he's coming back towards the land of promise, towards God's land, towards Canaan, and he meets these angels, he's essentially walking back into the garden, in a sense.
So it's a kind of a gateway into the sacred space.
Right. Yeah, I mean, he is coming back, into God's dwelling place, essentially, since he says this is God's camp, which is interesting because he was also greeted more or less by angels as he left.
Right,
so,
exactly.
Yeah, we're coming back to the chapter 28. Not exactly the location because he renames it something else.
Right.
But the idea is like, hey, the exodus that you just went through is over. I kept my promise. You've come back, and look how multiplied you are. So we're picking back up on the tensions of earlier in the story in chapter 28.
Right. So he calls it two camps, and that's a significant, or going to be significant throughout the chapter.
Yeah, because we see two camps actually throughout this. First of all, we see God's camp and Jacob's camp, and then Jacob later, as he fears Esau, is going to split his camps into two more camps. So there's just a little bit of foreshadowing and play going on here. I'm not entirely sure if there's something even deeper going on underneath the grain of this passage with the two camps, but it's at least just a little bit of play in the passage with the two camps. And which camps are the two camps? Is it God's camp and Jacob's camp, or is it his two camps? Maybe there's something there between hey, I'm in God's place, but still I'm trying to, again, still connive to get what I need.
Yeah, and I wonder if we're meant to see the contrast between the first time he calls it two camps. There's two camps in one, and then the second time he's splitting up his camp, and so he's dividing the camp into two. And so I don't know if, like you said, there may be more there, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, and so as we go on, Jacob, starting in verse 3, he sends some messengers before him to Esau in the land of Seir, instructing them, this is what you shall say. Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male servants, female servants, and I have sent word to tell you in order that I may find favor in your sight. So I think one thing that's interesting here, we're about to enter into another Exodus motif, another Exodus pattern in the book of Genesis. And he sends messengers before him. And again, the word messengers and angels, it's the same word in Hebrew. It's the word malach. And so we just have another instance of malach being sent before the person that's about to go through this Exodus. Possibly a little reach into the Exodus of Israel, where the angel of the Lord goes before Israel. The presence, the face of Yahweh goes before Israel. Maybe there's something going on there. And I think that would kind of play into the passage because we're going to see Jacob again enacting Exodus and seeking Esau in some ways that he should be seeking Yahweh. And anyway, we start off here in this instruction. We're again reminded of the previous Exodus pattern where he has all this wealth, this mixed multitude and possessions that we see as a staple of the Exodus pattern.
And so he sends his messengers to go have a conversation with his brother Esau. And we're supposed to remember the tension is there. The big question is, okay, how is Esau going to respond to Jacob? And has Esau's anger subsided, or is he still wanting to murder his brother?
Yeah, and then the author, he doesn't give us a great answer. I mean, you would think that in this kind of diplomatic situation, that Esau would make clear his intentions. Okay, great, he's back, go tell him that we're going to celebrate his coming, something like that. But there's nothing said. It just says, oh, by the way, Esau's coming to meet you. is that good or is that bad? We don't know. We're not told. So again, they're trying to heighten the suspense in the story, in the narrative, like what's going to happen, and Jacob's going to be under all this duress, under all this stress, trying to figure out, like, am I about to be destroyed? There's all these kind of oppressive overtones we're going to talk about that places us in this need for another Exodus. Yeah,
in the response that his messengers bring back just builds the tension even more, right?
Yeah, because they just say, when the messengers return, we came to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you. And there are 400 men with him. So, like, yeah, on top of not telling you why he's coming to meet you, he says there's 400 men. So, I mean, it sounds like an army.
Yeah,
so
it's a small militia.
Yeah, Jacob's in a bad spot. And so, therefore, it says he was greatly afraid and distressed. And so here's where, again, he divided his people who were with him, and he divided the flocks and the herds and the camels into two camps, thinking if one camp is attacked, the other will be left and escape. And then, after that, Jacob, he does something right here. He does something really good here in verses 9 to 12. It says that Jacob prays and calls on God to rescue him because of the promises that God had already made. And so he calls on God's faithfulness. He calls upon the plan of redemption that God is enacting through Jacob. He calls upon all the promises he's made, and says, hey, based on those promises, based on your faithfulness, deliver me and the family that you have built with me. And that was a good move. Jacob should have stopped there, essentially, and just, he should have stopped there.
Yeah, and it does seem like he's starting to turn a corner here, doesn't it? I mean, the prayer it's a beautiful prayer.
It does. And, I mean, a couple of just really interesting things I think to point out about this is that, so first of all, it says in verse 10 that I'm not worthy of the least of all your deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness you have shown to your servant. And so in Hebrew, that is chesed and emet. So loyal love and faithfulness. And we've talked about these already in chapter 24. That's the last time these appeared, when the servant was praying for these same characteristics of God to carry through and for him to bless the mission that the servant was sent on to find Rebekah. And then the next time we see this is in Exodus 34:6, where God is giving his attributes to Moses and says, I am a God of loyal love and faithfulness. And that is the most quoted line throughout the rest of the Old Testament, period, let alone just when you're describing God. And so here we have the characteristic statement about who Yahweh is quoted here as Jacob pleads for help. And then he also says here in verse 11, he says, please deliver me. So again, there's natsal, that's the word deliver used throughout these deliverance passages and the Exodus patterns and things like that. So we're asking for deliverance from the hand of my brother Esau, and delivering from the hand of someone appears again in the Exodus explicitly quite a few times, talking about Israel needing to be delivered from the hand of Pharaoh. So another call to that story. And he does fear here being attacked. And so that's kind of what we have. He fears being attacked. He asks for deliverance from the hand. And so those are just a few points regarding the Exodus that begins to tie the Exodus motif to this story. And there's more as we go. Yeah,
well, and like Moses, he refers to God's character and God's promises.
Right. Oh, and that just made me think about something that I forgot about last week. And so that's just the fact that he mentions fear here. And whenever Laban asks Jacob why he ran off and fled before telling him, he says that I feared you would take your daughters from me. And so there's just a little point there that Jacob kind of has the sister fib pattern turned on its head. He again fears about his wives. And it's not so much, he fears them being taken just like Rebekah and Sarah were taken. So within that story, there's just some elements that kind of remind you that sister fib and then turn it on its head, because the whole story is just backwards in so many ways. But again, just more patterning through Genesis.
Yeah, you see that here too. He's fearful because of his wives and his children.
Yeah. So we did that a couple weeks ago, but go back and if you're reading through that, just keep that in mind. And there was something else actually that I forgot to mention that I think we should bring up, just because I think it's interesting. So little detour, and then we'll get back to Mahanaim and chapter 32. And that was just the note that actually I remembered this, I think, because maybe you brought it up when we were preaching, or you were preaching, through chapter 27. And it's whenever Rebekah says, now my son, listen to my voice, and go deceive Isaac. Well, again, whenever he's being sent out to Laban, she says, now my son, listen to my voice. Exact same words again in verse 43 of chapter 27. And so, bad idea 1, you hear the same words again, bad idea number 2. Just wanted to, bring that up, because I know it was a few chapters ago, but I thought that was really cool, just more little literary stuff going on. And again, I think you brought that up during your sermon.
I may have. I can't remember.
Well, yeah. And by the way, if you think what we're doing here is helpful and you want to hear some application and more sermonic kind of discussion about this and further points, and even just to hear some preaching that has actually really academically considered the text and thinks through it well, go to our website, which is in the link for the notes, and all of Nate's sermons are on there. So go check those out. They're good. Yeah, if you're looking for good quality sermons, that's a good spot to go. So okay, back to chapter 32 after that detour.
All right, so where were we? You just finished up this prayer. You think that Jacob's turning a corner, but then...
Yeah, he should have stopped here. He really should have stopped here. But he continues, and at first it doesn't seem that bad, but there's some strange things about it. So we're picking up here in verses 13, and he took and sent a present, is what it says in verse 13. He sent a present to Esau. Now, the word gift or present here is mincha, which by itself... Okay, that's just what it means. But it can also be used to refer to gift offerings, gifts to Yahweh. It's used to refer to offerings. Actually, the last time this word was used was in Genesis 4:4 to refer to Abel's sin offering, which, again, if that being a sin offering is new to you, go back and listen to the episode on that. We talk about that. Now, what makes this extra interesting is that in verse 20, this mincha that is brought up a couple times is sent to Esau in order to appease his face, is what it says. I think in the ESV it just says that he wants to appease him. But it's the word kippur, his face. So he wants to cover his face, atone essentially for his sin with Esau, to Esau. It may not strictly mean atone here in the PL, kippur, but that KPR, that's the same words used for the word atonement throughout the Bible. It's the word atonement. And so we have him giving a mincha for the purpose of kippuring and for the purpose of having his face lifted. So in verse 20 it says he thought that he would appease or kippur Esau with the present, kippur his face, cover his face. Again, that's atonement language going on. And then it says, afterwards I shall see his face, and perhaps he will, in the ESV it says, accept me. Now what it says actually in the Hebrew is maybe he will lift my face. He will nasa my face. And so you hear a lot of face talk going on. We're going to talk about that in a second. But is there any other time in Genesis where we've talked about the lifting of someone in reference to a sacrifice?
Yeah, chapter 4.
Right. And God comes to Cain, and because he didn't offer the sin offering that Abel did, God says, hey, look, there's a sin offering lying. It's waiting for you. And before he says that, he says, why has your face fallen? If you do well, will there not be lifting? And so it's not a one-for-one, but there's a lot of elements in these sentences that are bringing us, or tying a connection between these stories. And so I think what might be going on here is Jacob has called out to Yahweh, and he has prayed for deliverance, which we're going to find out he receives. But he's still trying to connive his way to blessing by offering a mincha for atonement so that his face may be lifted. And so we're brought back to the failure of Cain. We see him acting and giving undue gifts to Esau in this situation. Not that it's necessarily bad for him to give these gifts, but we just have some ritual language going on which should typically only be applied or expected before Yahweh.
And it's an extraordinary amount of gifts, too. I mean, this is a gift for a king with the number of camels and animals that he's sending on, and kind of a parade of gifts where over and over he's going to
try and wear him down.
Yeah. He's very much seeming like he's trying to bribe his brother into accepting him or being appeased.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would think that he's stolen all of his blessings. Maybe if he gives him enough, he'll feel like, oh, I'm blessed now. It's fine.
Right.
Okay, so after this, he's already split his camps, and then he's prayed, and he has given this gift to Esau. And then it says in verse 22, we're getting into the section where Jacob wrestles with God. That's the heading in the ESV. It says, that same night he arose, he took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. Now it says that they all crossed and that he crossed the ford, but actually I think that it's more of a summary of what happened, and then the next 2 verses are going to tell us what actually happened. I think Jacob is going to be left on the other side of the river where he put his family over on the other side, and I think that the Word Biblical Commentary on Genesis, Wenham, he thinks as well it's possible that Jacob remains over on the other side of the Jabbok instead of traveling over with them, or possibly he went over there and then set him up and then he went back to the other side. But either way, the point is Jacob, he's coming from Paddan Aram, he's coming from the north, he reaches the river Jabbok, which flows east to west, and then he puts all of his family and his stuff on the south side, and he remains on the north side.
So he puts them in front of him so that he's protected.
Yes. Yeah. So if things weren't bad enough, he basically puts his family across the river closer to Esau's bait so that he has a safety barrier of the river. And if Esau comes, he has time to flee while everyone else, his entire family, is being slaughtered. So we're at a real high point in the Jacob narrative.
Right. He's a stand-up guy, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think reading this, it is a little confusing because it says that he crossed the ford Jabbok. In the Hebrew, it is a he crossed, like the masculine singular is applied to that. But we're told after that he sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and then in verse 24, he was left alone.
I think that's key. He was left alone.
Right. And so, yeah, he's off in the distance, and he should have been with them for sure in this situation. He's using them as bait or a decoy or whatever. And so at that point, this dude comes out of nowhere and just starts wrestling with him until the next morning. And
so he's alone. It's night. He's vulnerable. I think that's meant to kind of raise the tension of the story, too.
But he should be safe, too.
Well, but he put himself in danger,
right? In
a sense.
Well, he's protecting himself from Esau, and so he would think he's safe. But yeah, you're right. He's also vulnerable in another way.
Yeah.
And so there's a few things to touch on in this, and maybe the first thing is just to touch on, is this God that he's wrestling with? Because that's sometimes contested. And ultimately, he names the place Peniel by the end of the story, which means face of God. Whenever he's wrestling with him, he holds on to him and wants blessing because I think he knows who this is and he wants the blessing that God can give. And so I think Jacob knows that this is God. At the end, he says, I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. And some people will say because of this is the generic word for deity, for Elohim, for God, so maybe it's some other spirit or whatever that he's wrestling with. I think Hosea, reading back to this, actually shows us the proper interpretation. Do you want to actually read those verses that tell us that?
Yeah, so Hosea 12, I'm going to start in verse 3. In the womb, talking about Jacob, he took his brother by the heel, and in his manhood he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and he sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us. The Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his memorial name.
Right, and in verse 5 there where it says the Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his name, that's Yahweh. And so every previous occurrence of the word God in that passage in Hosea is talking about Yahweh. I think you would get that intrinsically just reading through Genesis here, but Hosea makes it explicit for us. And there's actually a really good section on this that's been, this topic I feel like has been well worn, but I just want to make everyone aware of it. But again, check out Angel of the Lord by Foreman and Van Dorn. They do a really good job walking through this passage and showing how this is the angel of the Lord, who is Yahweh, wrestling with Jacob.
Yeah.
So we'll leave that behind. But
so Jacob is wrestling with the pre-incarnate Jesus, is what we're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And that might sound weird to people. Go read the book. It's good. All right, so we've seen Jacob do some really incredible stuff throughout this story, though, haven't we? One thing I'm thinking of is removing the stone that it usually took a few shepherds to remove so that he could water the flocks of Rachel. Yeah,
we've seen superhuman strength out of him.
Right, and so he's portrayed actually in the Bible as kind of a Hercules figure,
right,
as far as strength. And here he's wrestling God, and he's winning. He's at least keeping a stalemate.
I don't like the word winning.
It says prevailed.
It does say prevailed, but later on, how does Jacob describe himself as prevailing? Surviving.
Almost dying. Right,
yeah.
Right.
So I think, to prevail against the Lord isn't to like win. God did not walk away from this fight limping.
Right.
Right. Jacob's the one that came away limping, and I think to prevail against the Lord is just I've wrestled and I survived that,
right.
And that was huge. That's what he means.
Yeah, I think this is supposed to parallel all of his previous conniving and striving, and him taking the blessings that Yahweh has given them and him trying to earn it himself and through his own work. Like he is accomplishing some amazing feats through, again, God's allowance and provision and helping those things. But here we see, he's trying to fight back against God and holding his own. Like we're supposed to see this as like, okay, you have some incredible strength and will and power. Ultimately, it's not going to match what God can do or has been doing for him. That's what we see and take away in this.
Yeah.
But it's just, Jacob is meant to be seen as this like kind of incredible character who gets humbled in this scene.
Yeah, I kind of look at this as like I used to wrestle with my kids all the time when they were little. Now if I do it, they beat me up. But when you're 5 times their size, I mean, you wrestle with them and you let them think that they're winning, at least for a while.
Yeah.
Eventually you might have to put them in their place. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. God's intentionally only using a fraction of his power and allowing Jacob to feel like he's prevailing.
Right. Yeah. So into the next little topic I think we should talk about in the wrestling with God. Have you ever been punched so hard in the crotch that your leg dislocates?
No, thank goodness.
So let's talk about this word touch. You talked about this. Every commentary, every commentary,
a lot of them,
a lot of sermons that you hear on this passage will say that God touched Jacob's thigh with such a light, dainty touch to display his power, but that's not really what's going on here.
Right, yeah, that word touched in other places in the Bible is not like a light tap.
Yeah, it can
mean
that, but it's a figurative word. So in chapter 28, verses 12, where I think earlier I was saying chapter 27 when I was referring back to that passage where God made a promise. If I said 27, I meant 28. But yeah, in chapter 28, verses 12, it says that the stairs that Jacob saw coming from heaven, they touched heaven. So maybe you could say, okay, that's a light, dainty touch, whatever.
Right.
But let's go to some other examples. God did not allow Abimelech to touch Rebekah. That's figurative.
Right.
There's some ways in which you understand, like, I've got 2 very small kids, and if I say, don't touch each other because they're annoying each other or fighting, if they start hugging, I'm not mad.
Right.
But if they're fighting, that's a big deal.
It's a touch that implies something negative, something violent, maybe.
Right. In some cases, it's just like the word touch in English. Touch can be a good thing. It can have comforting connotations or hateful connotations or romantic connotations or all those different things depending on how you use it. We also see that Eve, she wasn't to touch the fruit, but the 10 plagues are the same word. In some cases, it's different words that describe the plagues, but it's also translated as plagues and afflictions. In Exodus 12:17, for instance, Yahweh touched Pharaoh with great touchings. He afflicted Pharaoh with great plagues, is how the ESV says it.
Right.
Or in Exodus 11:1, describing the 10th plague, it says, I will strike or afflict Pharaoh one more time. It says, one more touch on Pharaoh. And so this can be a light, dainty touch, or it can be
a strike.
Yeah, a strike. Yeah, a plague or punching someone's lights out. Or here, Jacob, we'll say thigh for now. Punching him in the thigh so hard it pops out of socket. So maybe we should talk about the word thigh, though.
Yeah, so the word that's translated as hip or hip socket here, and other places translated as thigh. So, for example, we've got Genesis 24:2, and Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all he had, put your hand under my thigh. That's the same word in Hebrew. Same thing in Genesis. I think this one's significant. Genesis 46:26. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. Okay, so where's the word thigh there, or the word hip?
Yeah, so this one, it's in describing his descendants, it says those who came out of his thigh.
Yeah.
Now, people don't come out of thighs. This is talking about genitalia. It's not just thigh, but this word does denote genitalia.
Right.
In other places, it does mean side or something like that. It probably can refer to the thigh, just that, the whole region down there in your midsection. But it often, when referring to anatomy, refers to genitalia, or between your legs, because it's also the same thing in Exodus 1:5, where it says all descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. It's all the Nefesh Yotzei Yarach, that is, all of the lives that came out of his thigh or his genitalia. Talking about them again. And I think one more that's really interesting is the curse whenever there is a husband who is jealous. He suspects his wife of adultery. They do this whole trial by water thing, and she drinks the water, and it says, "Look, if you've committed adultery, may the Lord make your thigh fall away from your body." This is in Numbers 5, verses 21 and 22. It says, may the Lord make your yarech fall away, make your womb and genitalia fall away, not just her thigh. It's referring to sexual organs. And there's some significance to that too, especially in the Jacob story. So why would it be that he is striking his sexual organs?
So I think, in my opinion, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, but it seems like there's a good argument to be made that what's going on here is God is reminding Jacob of his covenant promises. And if you recall, the covenant promises were sealed with a sign, a symbol, through circumcision, because God had promised that his offspring, or his seed, would be fruitful and multiply and be a blessing to all nations. And so Jacob, through his life, has been really trying to wrestle with God for a blessing his whole life, and trying to take things into his own hands. And I think here God's hitting him where it hurts to remind him that, look, I'm the one that provides the blessing, not you. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a deeper level of meaning in where God's touched him or struck him.
Yeah, I think so. And just again, in verse 32, I think this is interesting that it talks about again, therefore to this day, the people of Israel don't eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip. That word socket is the word kaf, kaf, which can describe kind of the palm of your hand, or just like any kind of empty basin region, especially of the body. It often refers to the palm of the hand. And so essentially it's referring to, when it says hip socket, it is saying the pocket of his genitalia, the area between his legs where his legs kind of meet together. And so the story is saying that, they don't eat the tendons around that area, and the word there also is tendon, because Jacob got punched in the crotch so hard that something popped out of socket and he had to limp for, I guess, the rest of his life. I don't know. But
yeah, it doesn't say, but I mean, it was a hard hit. Yeah.
So anyway, that should be our opener if we ever talk about this in coffee talk. You've been punched in the crotch so hard that your leg popped out of socket.
And so the lesson here is, if you wrestle God, wear a cup. I think we're meant to see the irony here, though, that here we have Jacob refusing to let God go. And he's just prayed and recognized that God has this steadfast love for him. I mean, God's not let go of him his whole life. Even though Jacob has continually tried to take things into his own hands and has been foolish and a cheater, a deceiver, and yet God's held on to him because he made a promise. Yeah. And the irony here is Jacob didn't need to hold on to God, because God already had a hold of him and was not going to let him go. And I think, too, here we're meant to see the foreshadowing of, so he changes his name. So his first name, Jacob, was a prediction of who he was going to be like. He was going to be a trickster, a deceiver, a heel grabber. And then he changes his name to Israel. And I think that's a prediction of the rest of the story of the Israelites, that they spend the next several hundred years wrestling with God. Even though they're blessed by God, they do all sorts of things to wrestle with God and rebel, and sometimes they walk away with a limp too. Yeah. Until one day, because of God's faithfulness, he provides a remnant that would provide an offspring Jesus, who at the end of the day, he's the one that prevails. And because he prevails, all of us who have put our loyalty with him get to prevail also.
That's good.
So there's a whole lot of meaning. This is just a rich story. I love it.
Yeah. Well, we do have more to talk about as relates to the Exodus motif here in this passage, but I think on that note, we'll pick that back up next time and continue just finishing out this discussion on Jacob wrestling with God and how that ties into the Esau story overall.
I like it.